interested. I'm Dale Larson, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of the Bowie knife today, and particularly about the Edwin Forest knife. I'm going to stick to my script because otherwise we'll be here all day. So let's, are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's begin. Well, let me see, I need my little controller. Well, it all started with a duel in which no one got hurt. On September 19th, 1827, two men met on a Mississippi River sandbar near Natchez, Mississippi, and exchanged shots without effect. And having satisfied their honor, the two men shook hands, and one suggested that they invite their respective groups of friends that had accompanied them to the sandbar to join them in a glass of wine. That should have been the end of it, in which case we would have never heard of it. But it wasn't. You see, there were other enmities and grievances between certain members of one party and certain members of the other party. And as they moved toward each other, one of them called to his opponent in the other group and said maybe this was a good time to settle their differences. The next thing we know, guns were drawn, shots were fired, and when it ended, two were dead and others were wounded. Well, during this deadly affair, one man who had already been shot drew what witnesses described as a large butcher knife that he usually carried. And he pursued his attacker, who fled. The attacker's friends shot the man down and then attacked him with their sword canes. Before his friends could arrive to help him, the man with the knife had reached up, grabbed one of the attackers, thrust his knife into his heart, killing him. And then he slashed another of his assailants. Well, the arrival of his friends ended the fight, but the man was not expected to live because he had multiple gunshot and stab wounds. And if he had died, he would have been at best a footnote to history, but he didn't. And in living, he became a legend. And of course, his name was James Bowie. Well, this made the news. Today we refer to the account of the sandbar fight. Newspapers all over the country reported on the event, and a few gave it a benign heading such as an affair of honor, but most of them used more colorful headings such as you see here. One of the local Natchez newspapers, the Ariel, headed its report of the previous day's event with dual assassination. And this is what they said. They concluded that, well, these are the only particulars which have reached us of this most horrid outrage, which for the present we offer no comment. Well, the story was kept alive as other participants wrote their versions of the event in order to justify their own roles, and that got republished by other papers. And witnesses' accounts usually referred to the large butcher knife or the big knife that he carried. Well, the idea of having a big knife to defend yourself against a sword apparently captured the imagination of the public, and soon people must have been asking their local blacksmith or cutler for a knife like Bowie's. But since there was no detailed description of a knife like Bowie's, it could be whatever someone imagined it to be. Eventually the term Bowie knife entered the public lexicon. Well, what is a Bowie knife? That invites the question. As Norm Federman said in his introduction to the antique Bowie knife, the term Bowie knife, one whose name has since become a generic term to cover a wide range of weapons and a common noun in the English language, is unique in the history of American arms as the only weapon named after a folk hero. So what is a Bowie knife? Well, for most of you, it probably looks like this. This prop was used in the movie The Iron Mistress and also in the Adventures of Jim Bowie TV show, and it exhibits the kind of characteristics that you might expect from a classic form. Big blade, big clip point, and a big crossguard. Well, anyway, it was originally, I guess this was written originally in a book by James Thorpe, and that became the first reference to a knife with a brass back. And from that, it found its way into the Iron Mistress books, from then into the movie. And so the idea of a Bowie knife having a brass back became imprinted on the public consciousness, but really only since 1948 when the book The Bowie Knife was covered. So today, since the 1950s, numerous knives have appeared and been discovered, but there are numerous and varying descriptions of a Bowie knife, many featuring a small guard or some sort of clip point, but none mention anything like a brass back. In fact, the earliest use of the term Bowie knife that we've found to date is from a series of ads that appeared beginning in December of 1830 for a lock spring Bowie knife. So probably a folding knife or a switchblade isn't exactly what pops in your mind when I say Bowie knife. So we do have by the time of the 1830s, mid-1830s, Bowie knives were already in pretty much disrepute. You can see here that the Philadelphia magazine suggested that there should be heavy penalties for fine and imprisonment for using a Bowie knife. Actually, in Alabama, they passed a rule against Bowie knives or Arkansas toothpicks, but they never really described what they were. So either everybody sort of thought they knew, or it was like we have today. It's like, what do you mean by Bowie? Well, it depends on what you mean. But in 1838, a man named P.Q. wrote an early description of the Bowie knife, and he was trying to recount the history of the Bowie knife's origin. And he said, among many means invented for man's destruction, the Bowie knife is the most effective in execution, the most fearful to the sight and imagination. The blade measures 12 inches in length, fashioned of excellent material. True Damascus was never better. Observe its edge, keen and smooth, and so perfect that a barber might use it in his trade. Its point is curved and hollowed at the back, cutting both ways like a two-edged sword. It is 2 inches broad at the heel and of proportionate thickness. Its weight alone is sufficient to give effect to a descending blow, and a child thus armed might well intimidate a man of strength and courage. Well, the story was full of inaccuracies about the history of the knife, and it elicited this pointed response from James Bowie's brother, Reason. And he wrote, the first Bowie knife was made by myself as a hunting knife. The length of the knife was 9 1/4 inches, its width 1 1/2 inches, and it was single-edged, and the blade not curved. Now, for what it's worth, his descendants actually say he didn't make the knife, his blacksmith made it, but he had it made as his direction. He later added that the improvements in the state of in its fabrication and the state of perfection for which it is since acquired from experienced cutlers was not brought about through my agency. But he certainly took advantage of the improvements. This is a story that appeared in 1836 in the New York Herald, and it says, Bowie knife, who invented the Bowie knife? Not James Bowie, nor anymore did he contrive the knife which bears his name. That kind of knife was the production of Reason Bowie, brother of James, one of a desperate daredevil family who had been the terror and proverb of the whole Southwest. Do you wish to see his likeness? And the formidable, terrible weapon which his bloodthirsty ingenuity contrived. Go to Bishop's barroom in New Orleans. There hangs his portrait. A brown and swarthy creature with a hard face, stern cold eye, and a firm lip, open bosom, and the blood-chilling knife in his clenched hand. If you wish to see the original, there he is in Donaldsonville on the Mississippi, half blind yet a terror, breathing vengeance on his brother's slayers, and ready to fight them from a corner of a handkerchief at a moment's warning. In a duel some years ago, Reason, holding the corner of a handkerchief, and his antagonist cut up another Spaniard most terrifically. Here's a portrait, and there's a copy hanging in the hall, as well as of the art. But if you look closely, there we go. I lit this from the bottom, and you can just see the blade of the knife there. And if you compare it to this knife, which was made by Philadelphia surgical instrument maker Henry Shively and Mark Shively, Philadelphia, the metal scabbard is engraved with the legend "Presented to Jesse Perkins by R.P. Bowie in 1831. There's a copy of that knife in the display case. It's now in the Mississippi Historical Archives in Jackson. The engraving was done over an earlier scratched inscription, and there's good reason to believe that the date may be in error. But the initials RPB are scratched on the pommel here, and also on the pommel, and also on the frog stud. And we think James may have actually ordered it on one of his Eastern trips, maybe in 1828 or 29, and given it to his brother. But if you look at the knife in the portrait, and this is a photograph of the actual portrait, and the Shively knife held in the same position, you can see it's almost certain that this is the Perkins knife that Reason was holding for that portrait. And Bishop's City Hotel was opened in New Orleans in 1832 with a 100-foot long bar room, considered to be the finest in America. So it's likely the painting was commissioned then, because Reason had achieved recent notoriety in relationship to his fight with Indians, he and his brother and some other men, while they were hunting for the legendary San Saba silver mine. And it seems likely that probably Reason didn't actually give away that knife until maybe 1834. But it certainly is the knife he was holding in the portrait. Now these are knives that are claimed to be gifts from Reason Bowie. The top knife, made from a blacksmith file with an 8.5-inch blade, was donated to the Alamo by the granddaughter of Bowie's good friend Caiaphas Ham, who said it was given to him by Reason. Ham described Jim Bowie's sandbar knife as made by a man named Lovell Snowden from a model whittled by James, and not more than 12 inches long, handle and all, which is about the size of this knife. The next knife is another made by Shively with a 10.25-inch blade. It's the Perkins knife that we just showed earlier. The next knife, this one was made by a man named Daniel Searles of Baton Rouge, and by family tradition, Josiah Stafford was traveling with Reason and others and became ill and was left behind, and Reason gave him his personal knife for protection. And indeed, on the escutcheon plate is the R.P. Bowie's engraved. And it may be that when Reason got this one, he didn't need this knife, so he gave it away, because now he had this prettier knife. Then the next knife, on the scabbard, there's an engraving that says that this was presented R.P. Bowie to H.W. Fowler, U.S.D., for U.S. Dragoons. This is called the Fowler knife, and it's now on display at the Alamo. The last knife has a legend saying that it was made and presented to his friend Captain Thomas Tunstall by Colonel Bowie, White River, Arkansas, near Batesville, 1833. And a diary entry quotes Tunstall as saying, "The knife was made expressly for me by Reason Bowie." And it is very similar to a group of knives that are thought to have been made by James Black of Washington, Arkansas. But these last four are certainly improvements over a blacksmith-made knife like that one. But what is conspicuously missing is a big curved clip point, and certainly no brass back. And most of them have no guard or just a very small guard. Well, did Reason or James invent anything about the Bowie knife? Well, let's see. Here is this looks like a kind of classy Bowie knife. This looks like a guardless Bowie knife. This looks like another guardless Bowie knife with a nice big flip curve. Well, the first one is a drawing of St. Bartholomew by Albrecht Dürer, done about 1523. Second is also St. Bartholomew, then around 1500 by Francisco Morone. And the third image is Abraham and Isaac, probably dating to the 15th century, and is currently in the Duomo in Verona, Italy. Now, you might think this is an old excavated guardless coffin hill Bowie. It's actually a scramsax from the 9th or 10th century, but it looks kind of like a garterless clip point. The next one could be a straight back Bowie with a little integral guard, but it's really a Bacillard from about the 14th century. This next knife, these two knives are known as Hausbauers. They're basically a house weapon, and they date from the mid-15th to 16th century. But you see they have a little clip guard, they have a little nagel, it's called, that also keeps your hand from slipping, but the blades look a lot like a big Bowie knife. So, been around for quite a while, there's really nothing new under the sun. Well, back to the 19th century. Over the years, the improvements referenced by Bowie took a myriad of forms. If you look at these books illustrating the large number of 19th century Bowie knives, you'll see like these, you'll find a variety of shapes and sizes. So you'll see that everything under the sun got included in the term Bowie knife. And of course, here's collections that show what a wide variety you would see. There's more. These are just from different knife shows. And of course, some are really works of art. So, today, Bowie knives basically defy precise description, but you'll see knives with clip points and guards, knives without guards. That kind of runs the gamut of the different styles that we associate today with Bowie knives, and some actually have more of a spear point, double-edged, we call them a dagger. So really, as in the beginning, Bowie knife today is more of an iconic idea than a specific thing. It's safe to say that for collectors, any real knife from the mid-19th century of moderate to large size, suitable as a weapon, is probably considered an antique Bowie knife. But whatever reasons ruled in its development, it was James who gave his name to the Bowie knife. And with his involvement in the Texas Revolution, his death at the Alamo, his place in history and legend was firmly established. And while there are several known knives believed to have been given by recent Bowie, there is only one extant knife that can be reliably connected directly to James Bowie. That's the knife the great American actor Edwin Forest claimed that James Bowie gave to him. And this story is the story of that knife and the controversy its appearance engendered. It's the story of what is generally known as the Edwin Forest Bowie knife, or simply the Forest knife. And my goal today is to show you the evidence and give you a sense of why this knife is so important to the history of the Bowie knife. If it was a gift from James Bowie, it is not only an important piece of American history, it is also a significant contributor to our understanding of the early development of the Bowie knife. And prior to 1993, reports that Edwin Forest, who was the most famous and successful actor of his day, had been given a Bowie knife were not unknown, but were considered kind of a historical footnote because for all practical purposes, the knife was considered lost. His biographies mentioned that he had been given a knife by Bowie, but most of the later ones rely on the first two. The first of these was by his friend James Reese, and the second, by Reverend Alger, was the official biography, but he didn't complete it and publish it until 1887, nearly 5 years after Forrest died. But what Alger said was his favorite knife, used by him, and he's talking about James, awfully in many an awful fray, he presented as a token of his love to Forrest, who carefully preserved it among his treasured keepsakes. Reese's book recounted a visit with his daughter to the library and gallery of Forrest's home, probably in 1871. And this is what it said. We stood for a few moments before a case in which rested a Scottish claymore, and fancy carried us back to the blood-stained field of Culloden. There also was a sort of Talma, the greatest of French actors wielded on the mimic stage, and there also the original knife which on the world stage bears the name of its inventor, Colonel Bowie. As I said, Edwin Forrest was by far the most popular and successful actor on the American stage during his lifetime. He made a fortune, and he left it all, including his home, library, art, and his arms collection, including the Bowie knife, to the establishment of a home and furnishing of a home for down-and-out actors. Well, the Edwin Forrest home moved to a new building in 1928. And there, in the hallway, stood this arms case, which had mostly theatrical weapons, but also the Bowie knife, which is right here. And this is a sealed case, and it stood in the entrance of the hall. But by 1987, the Forest home had exhausted its endowment from all the money over the years, and decided to merge with another home for actors and to basically disperse the collection. So in 1988, Norm Flederman received this letter from a man named Will Stapp, who was had been asked by the home to help determine if the Bowie's knife that the home had was authentic. And along with the letter was sent this picture, a black and white photo of the knife that was taken sometime after it was removed from the case in 1987. Well, Flederman didn't have the time to deal with the project, so he forwarded with this note the letter and the picture to Bill Williamson, who was a major Bowie knife collector and researcher, and the author of numerous books on Bowie knives. Well, Williamson wrote back saying, as a veteran collector, I've never been so shaken, and he was stunned. He was elated because he thought that the knife had been destroyed in a fire that was recounted in Reese's biography about a fire in the library, and he made it sound like the whole thing was destroyed. He assumed the knife was there and that the thing had been burned up, and he had written that in 1974 in an article on Bowie knives. So here he is, he found out the knife is still existing, and he eventually persuaded them to sell him the knife. And this process is pretty interesting, and it's in my forthcoming book, but I don't have time to talk about it today. But because the knife had active rusting spots, as you can see in this photo, he had it carefully conserved the following year. Then he spent several years researching and acquiring other objects related to a display. And then in 1993, he unveiled the knife to the public. Well, when that happened, some were ready to believe that this was the very knife James used on the sandbar to save his life that fateful day in 1827. Others were not even willing to accept that James Bowie had ever touched the knife. So almost immediately, certain individuals began a campaign of myths and imaginations to discredit the knife as anything connected to James Bowie. The essence of that campaign appeared in two important publications a decade later with very similar stories. One was Flederman's otherwise fine book, The Bowie Knife, which is now out of print. And the other was in a book an article by Jack Edmondson, J.R. Edmondson, in Blade magazine. And unfortunately, both of these men were taken in by a disinformation campaign that was passed off as real research by a man with an axe to grind against Bill Williamson. So among other things, the stories have been said that the Forest wasn't credible, probably made up the story, that there were no credible evidence that they'd ever met, that the knife had been appraised for the Forest home in 1986 as a $170 silver-plated theatrical prop, and that Williamson had the blade refinished to remove the silver plate. Now, I deal with all of these and other baseless objections in my forthcoming book, but I don't have time to go into all of it today, but you can see some of the evidence in the display. But what do you think? You're all mostly collectors. What do you think if somebody comes along as an authority and tells you that a piece in your collection isn't any good, right? Most of us made at least one mistake in our careers, right? If we're actively collecting. But having been so prominently raised, the questions demanded an investigation and answers. And eventually I realized that not publicly answering the charges was a disservice to the collecting community because they're being misled by what they thought were credible sources. So what is following is the highlights of 3 years of very intensive research. A research for the truth. Because most of it is previously unknown, and much of it has been published, a little bit of it, in the Knife magazine article last fall. So if you didn't read it and you're interested, I do have some extra copies that I'd be happy to give you. But it raises two questions, right? First one is, did James Bowie give Forrest a knife? The second is, well, even if he did, is this the knife that he gave him? Well, until recently, we only had the assertions of Forrest biographers and some newspaper stories that were written after Forrest's death, saying that Forrest had a knife from Bowie. It was generally presumed, however, that the source of these assertions in the biographies was Forrest himself, and now we know that's the case. A few days after Forest died, the Chicago Daily Tribune published a story on December 22nd by George Alfred Townsend, who wrote under the pen name Gath. And in it, Gath tells how he first met Forrest in December of 1861 at the Academy of Music in Philadelphia. And under the heading Anecdotes, he shares three things that struck him because he always eulogized them. And he says, right here, another thing was an enormous Bowie knife with a blade fully a foot long, which he said James Bowie presented him. And he always coupled the production of this knife with a long-winded story about one of Bowie's duels, which related how Bowie and another man tied their left hands together and how Bowie cut the other man's bowels out so that they fell out in a way Forrest described with a particular whoop and gulp and made people sick to the stomach. But it's another story by Gath that was particularly important. In a story in 1882 entitled A Philistine's Diary, that was a play on Gath of the Philistines, for the Sunday Chronicle in San Francisco, he provides his recollections of Forrest of Tragedian. And he describes that same meeting at the Academy of Music in 1861, tells how a week later he was invited to visit Forrest at his home. And he says he told a story about meeting James Bowie, the duelist, an inventor of the Bowie knife, apropos a huge knife which was affixed to one of the bookshelves like a sign. I recollect enough of the story to outline it. I was well acquainted with James Bowie, Forrest said, and he thought a great deal of me, and he gave me that Bowie knife, which he had made to order on his measurements and plans. He was, like most duelists, given to spells of melancholy, and I desired him to tell me that story of killing blank with that knife in Texas or Louisiana. I said to him several times, Bowie, I want you to tell me that story. He would shake his head and turn the matter aside. I observed that he always wore a serious face for some minutes after this request. Finally, I found him in a mood to break down the barriers of his usual restraint, and he said to me, well, Forrest, I'll tell you the story. And then he continues with the details of the duel story, which he'd only alluded to in his obituary. And I've got a copy of the newspaper article on the wall of my display. You can read it. There's another story that actually appeared earlier, and it was by another reporter. His name was Alfred Trample, and it appeared in the May 7th, 1871 issue of the Capital, and it was titled At Home with Edwin Forest. And the author, Trample, recounts a visit to his Forest home one December. It was probably in 1866 or 67 based on the clues that he's left. But he added, close by the placard was a huge knife looking very much like a cutler's sign or a butcher's cleaver for pantomime. That, said Forrest, was the original Bowie knife, made and used by James Bowie. Did you ever hear a story related of it? We signified our desire to do so. And again, he says, I tried for a long time to get Bowie to tell me that story. But he always refused or turned the conversation to another topic. One night in New Orleans, after the theater dismissed, we took a long walk and became quite confidential. Now, said I, Bowie, give me that story. Well, we sat down, sir, and Bowie told me. It was a terrible story. And then he relates the same story of this knife fight that Gath relates. So even though these stories are told 5 or 6 years apart, and it's to different reporters, the story is very consistent. I don't have time again to go into it now, but you can read it on the display. But the important thing is that Forrest said Bowie told him the story. And Forrest said his knife was used in that fight. He never is quoted as claiming his knife was the knife from the sandbar fight. So he has no conflict with Reason's claim that James used his knife. And his biographers don't make that claim, although they do assert that Forrest received a knife from Bowie. But not everyone believes Reason's claim that it was Reason's knife that was used by his brother that fateful day. He certainly wasn't there. And those who think the Forrest knife is the knife used on the sandbar rely on that fact to dismiss his claim. I discuss all this in the book, but I do think Reason's claim is a serious obstacle to overcome, especially since Forrest doesn't make such a claim, and he must have known about the fight because it was so well known and he was a friend of his. But the important thing here is that Forrest explicitly says that Bowie gave him the knife. But was he telling the truth? Well, the skeptics needed some evidence to challenge it, and since the evidence for having the knife from Bowie rests primarily on Forrest's claim, it's important to challenge his veracity if you're going to challenge the knife. They found a presumably a credible ally in William C. Davis, who in his 1990 book about Bowie, Travis, and Crockett said, quote, "A lot of nonsense has been written about Bowie and Forest, most of it generated by Forest himself in that Alger book, which is really an autobiography. Forest would claim in the book and afterward that he and Bowie became devoted friends until a fallout over a woman, and that Bowie so loved Forest that he gave him his celebrated knife, quote, used by him awfully in many an awful fray," close quote. It was pure fiction from an actor who invented much of his history. Well, unfortunately, whatever his expertise on Bowie, Davis's expertise on Forest is non-existent, and his critical opinion has no basis in fact. The Alger book is not an autobiography. Alger was the official biographer, but the book wasn't finished until 5 years after Forest's death, and Alger makes it clear he used multiple sources in addition to his interviews with Forest. Alger doesn't say there is no evidence anywhere that Forest and Bowie ever fought over a woman. I can show, in the book, I show the source of that quote. It was made up by a plagiarist in the 1940s, which he stole from, most of the story he stole from an article written about 3 years earlier in the Atlantic, and then he added this line about the fight. I don't know where he got it, but there's no evidence for it. So whatever the merits of his work on Travis, Crockett, and Bowie, and it's a very detailed and footnoted book, he's no more reliable on Forest than Edmondson or Flederman are on the Forest knife. And then they also cite another book, a later biography on Forest they quoted this guy from Montrose Moses. And then they also quote a theater critic who was a contemporary of Forest, who called Forest personally an utterly selfish man, which even if it were true, being selfish doesn't make him dishonest. And I thoroughly deal with both of these in my book, but I can only highlight it today. Flederman notes that Moses admitted that Forest told Alger, his official biographer, to, quote, tell the blunt truth in every particular, and no matter where it hits or what effect it may be, close quote. But then he cites Moses' opinion that Forest wouldn't have wanted to be the last, he would be the last person to want such analytical frankness. Well, unless he's channeling Forrest's ghosts, what he describes, what he thinks Forrest wanted or didn't want, is totally his subjective opinion, because he never met the man. He was born too late. It's also clear from reading Moses that he simply didn't like the style of acting that Forrest epitomized. And Winter's utterly selfish man characterization has basically to do with his acting style, not his personal generosity, which is very well documented in newspaper reports of Forrest giving this, that, and of course the Forrest home itself is an outstanding example of his generosity. He left everything to take care of the unfortunate. So the simple fact is that no one has offered any evidence that any of his contemporaries or even his critics ever accused Forrest of untruthfulness. In contrast to the slurs on his integrity, there's plenty of evidence from people who knew him that supports his reputation for integrity and the hatred of lying. In that same article that I mentioned earlier in the Capitol, Trample quotes one of Forrest's fellow actors in it, who's an admirer. He said, quote, he held his honor equally in high esteem, and he despised the liar. And he added he was truthful. Furthermore, consider this. The Bowie connection is an inconsequential part of the Forrest biographies by Rees and Alger. It certainly wasn't central to the visit stories by Gath and Trample. So if any of them doubted Forrest's veracity, they could have just left it out or commented, that this was dubious information. The bottom line is there's no credible evidence to support the accusation that Forrest was a liar or made stuff up. But the accusation that Forrest concocted the story about Bowie invites another question. If it wasn't true, why would he make up this particular story? Except for the moment that the disparagement of Forrest's character that the story implies, if self-aggrandizement is your goal, why pick James Bowie? Self-aggrandizement requires a target audience that will be suitably impressed by your concocted story. But Forrest's world was the world of Philadelphia, New York, the theater, and those involved in it, not the South, and certainly not Bowie knife collectors. Consider the attitude that that during these times that the Bowie knife was already engendered. Here's some of the comments. Wearing a Bowie knife is disgraceful and cowardly practice. We're all already infamous for our Bowie knives. Against the Bowie knife, we entertain a particular horror. Or this story in the Pennsylvanian, whoever carries a Bowie knife is a coward. You know, or this story from the, it says, it's worse than barbarous, a fiendish they might be called, instrument of human destruction. So in Forest's world, the Bowie knife was a revolting tool of the desperado, criminals, hot-headed members of the lower class, and Bowie's reputation as a knife fighter certainly would not made him welcome in high society in New York or Philadelphia. So there really wasn't much reason. And furthermore, while Forest displayed his knife in his home, and he would tell the story along with all the other things he had, paintings and a Shakespeare folio and sort of things, and he'd tell the story to people who were interested. There's no evidence that he ever tried to publicly, tour the knife or make some big public announcement that he had. Now, this is a picture of the library in the first Forest home, and if you look at the close-up through the doorway of the annex, you can just see one of the weapons cases and what looks like maybe a couple swords in there in the shadow. This, it's an old photograph. But that's where we know the weapons were displayed in the original Forest home before they were consolidated into a single case when they moved. Well, before we leave the subject, one basis to challenge Forest's truthfulness is the famous knife fight that he recounted to both Gath and to Trample. And it's also in Alger's book, a version of it. There were numerous versions circulating about a fight between a Spaniard and either James or Reason Bowie, no later than 1836. We saw that in the article that I showed you earlier about the portrait. But in his letter that responded to that PQ story in 1838, where he said, I made the first Bowie knife, he says, categorically that neither he nor his brother James were ever involved in a duel. And a lot of people have said, well, then this couldn't have happened. Well, the reason was maybe fudging a little bit because he was the second in a proposed duel by between his cousin, another Bowie, and a Colonel Nichols. And the terms are the weapons would be Bowie knives of 10 inches and 3/4, or 10 and 3/4 inch blades. And the duel never occurred because Colonel Nichols skipped town rather than cross blades with a man named Bowie. But based on this statement, people have said, and there are no concurrent events, about this particular event, people have said, well, it never happened. And I deal with all this in the book again. But there basically are three possibilities. One is that Forest made it up, as the critics say. The two would be that Bowie made it up, just to, tell it was the age of tall tales, and might have just been something that, gets Forest off his back with his pestering question. And third, there is the possibility that there really was an event, even if it was embellished over time. And certainly there is documentary evidence of other rather brutal conflicts, so it wouldn't have stood out as anything particularly remarkable. What was remarkable about the sandbar fight was it was between people who weren't part of the duel. That was what made it so interesting at the time. But the accusation that Forest made it up just doesn't have any support because of all the evidence he was truthful. But there's a good reason to believe that that Bowie told the story. This is some photocopies of a handwritten autobiography by Reverend Benjamin Chase, who was a prominent clergyman in Louisiana and Mississippi, and wrote in his biography about 2 weeks he spent riding with James Bowie from Texas to Louisiana in 1833. And he said he rode constantly by my side and seemed to take pleasure in relating his exploits. And he relates how Bowie told him about the sandbar fight and about the so-called San Sabi Indian fight, which happened in 1833. And then he says he mentioned several of his encounters with Indians, one of which I've often heard spoken of as characteristic of him. An Indian was angry with him about a threat made against the big captain, as they called him. Bowie proposed they should sit facing each other on a log and settle it with their knives. The Indian consented and was almost instantly cut to pieces. Now, for our purpose, it doesn't matter if that event really happened. although certainly the Sandbar fight and the San Saba Indian fight certainly did. But what matters is that here's evidence that Bowie told such a story, which supports Forrest's veracity when he says, well, this is what Bowie told me. So if you may not believe Bowie, but it's a reason to believe Forrest. So you can't be dismissed on the basis that it can't possibly be true. There's nothing that precludes Forrest and James Bowie from being acquainted or from Bowie giving Forrest a knife. On the contrary, they were contemporaries and are documented to have been in the same vicinity at the same time on multiple occasions where they could have met. I lay out all this in my book, but they could have met. Bowie spent his winters in New Orleans in 1824 and 1825, and that's when Forrest started appearing. He started, his first appearances were in January of 1824. He was there till mid-1825, so they could have met and become friends, which is what Alger claims in their biography. They could have reconnected in New York or Philadelphia in 1826 and again in 1828 when Bowie is documented to have traveled to the east. Or in Natchez, New Orleans, or one of Bowie's plantations in 1829 when Forrest appeared in Natchez and New Orleans. Or again in Philadelphia, New York in 1829 when James traveled there again, or possibly in 32 if some reports that they were there then are correct, but certainly in 1833 when we know Reason told a story about the San Saba Indian fight, which was published in the Philadelphia papers in August. And then Forrest was back in New Orleans and Natchez in the spring of 1833, and possibly Bowie could have been there. And he may have come back in the fall. And then he was there again in New Orleans in March of 1834, and it's possible Bowie could have been in Louisiana, though he was in Texas a lot then. Then, if there's any truth to this 1837 story that appeared in the Arkansas Advocate, James Bowie had a knife made according to his instructions near the Mulholland plantation on Bayou Buff in Rapides Parish in 1820. In that case, Bowie would have had a knife to give to Forrest as early as 1824 or 1825. He would have also had one to use in a fight with a neighbor as early as 1820, even if he didn't tell Forrest the story until later, as late as 1833 or 4. We do know that in 1820, James was living on his brother Stephen's plantation on Bayou Buff in Avoyelles Parish, just over the Rapides Parish border, and about 20 miles from the Mulholland plantation. And Reason's plantation was just down the bayou from there. So, the bottom line is, there's just no credible basis to discredit Forrest's claim that James Bowie gave him the knife. But the question remains, if Bowie gave Forrest the knife, how do we know the Forrest knife is that knife? Could the Forrest knife be merely a theatrical prop masquerading as a Bowie knife? Well, in 1993, a To Whom It May Concern letter laid out these allegations that were the basis for the objections raised by Flederman and Edmondson. They had accepted the, quote, research accompanying this letter as credible, but it turns out it wasn't. The primary evidence was this marked up copy of a record sheet on the Forrest collection. And this was completed in 1987 by a clerk named Ellen Ramsey, whose initials ER are at the bottom. I also have a copy of this out in the display. But it was not an appraisal record. It was a pre-made form completed on items in the Forrest home collection, and its purpose was to document that the collection items had been dispersed and where they went. And the clerk took her information from an appraisal submitted in 1986, item 282R, right there, and from page 37 of a 1913 appraisal, which he mistakenly wrote as 1912. And accompanying this sheet, marked up sheet, was this photocopy of the knife, that I showed you earlier that was black and white. I should back up here to say, and under medium she wrote silver plate, comma, leather scabbard. So then this photo was sent around, and of course it has this caption, says the Forrest Metamora knife before William E. Williamson refinished it. Well, if you'd never seen a color photo of the knife, like the one I showed earlier, you might believe that that was tarnished on a silver-plated blade, especially when you're looking at a photograph. And so you might believe that Miss Ramsey was saying that the blade was silver-plated. But if you look at the actual appraisals, it makes it clear what she actually meant. Fortunately, these appraisals are still available, and they're in the collection of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The one that from 1986 that she took, item 282R, was done by Spiller in January 1986. And you can see what he appraised the knife as was a leather-handled 15-inch dagger with a leather case and silvered metal mounts, $170. That's it. The next appraisal, if you look here in the case, I want to point out, there's the knife in the glass case. And when Spiller appraised it in 1986, that's where it was. He never handled the knife, which is probably why he thought it had a leather handle, because to open that case, you have to take 26 screws off the back and take the back off, and that wasn't done until July 29, 1987. The reason I know it's 26 screws is because I counted them because the case is in my garage. And even then, the objects were wired to the case back. Because here's the case, they took the back off, leaned it up against the wall, and you see all the pieces are still there because they're all wired to the back. So there was no way to, until you cut the wires, to even look at that. And then she took this photo and elements of it and cut it up and put it with the record sheets that I showed you earlier. The other appraisal in 1913 was by the Federal Appraisal Company, and this is what it said. Antique Bowie knife, made by General Bowie and presented to Edwin Forest by the General, and used in the part Metamora, which was wrong, but he thought it was. Black leather, silver mounted scabbard. Again, nothing about the blade, silver only referring to the scabbard. So when you look at this clean report, you see what she was trying to interpolate between the two appraisals. And she simply put a comma. She was talking about the scabbard mounts being silver plate, and because of the comma, it allowed people to misinterpret what she was trying to say. But it said also, you notice it says nothing about condition, which she should have said, oh, it was rusty. You know, if she'd seen the blade, she would have said, hey, it needs to be conserved. And then this was the original photo that was taken to go with that record sheet. And then later they took the other photo that I showed, the black and white photo, and replaced it. And this record sheet is now in the Philadelphia City Museum, along with the whole binder of all the records. So after the knife was taken out in 1987, they brought in another appraiser, a man named Russ Pritchard Jr. This was done in August of 1987. And he basically went through all the described, all the weapons, examined 20 weapons, and he noted that all the objects had been subjected to abrasive substance and then lacquered. And his appraisal of the knife is described like this. It's an American side knife with a silver-mounted sheath, 12-inch blade, unmarked, with a wooden handle affixed with 3 metal rivets without any guard. Leather, silver-mounted scabbard, piece is 16 3/8 inches. Overall, he's a little off, but condition is good. The knife has been abrasively cleaned and lacquered. The blade now showed some corrosion. Now, these photos were taken on August 1st, 1988, and you can see nothing's been done at that point. This was before Williamson got it a year later. And you can see the rust. It's pretty active. So, I think that should answer the question that about the silver-plated blade. As you can see, it's rusted. So, well, could it have still been used as a prop? Well, or could it still be a prop, I guess is the question. Well, no. If you look at the Forest knife, it's a real knife. You've seen it out there. It's the form and construction that you would expect from an early Bowie knife made in the 20s or 30s. You look at the way that the scales are reversed, relieved to fit the tapered tang, and you notice that the tang is tapered from top to bottom as well as from front, or from back to front, or back to front to back. The blade is tapered, the edge of the spine is relieved, and if you look at the X-rays, you can see that their rivets, actually there are little cones there, which was the way that the knife rivets were attached. You can see that there's the bevel on the blade on the top. In other words, there was a lot of work that went into this knife, and the tip has been broken off maybe a 1/16 of an inch or something. you look at the scabbard and look at the silver mounts and the very careful work, the way that the scabbard belt loop was actually stitched into the throat. So you get an idea of the quality and the workmanship that you wouldn't put into a prop like the Metamora prop that's on the other side of the table. This is how it might have looked if it had a butt cap and a silver collar, which some people, James Batson thinks that originally had a silver collar, might have. It was certainly relieved for a butt cap, but it's been missing since, you know, the knife was in the case and that it came out of, but it might have originally had one, or maybe it never got put on. Well, even so, could have been used as a prop. You know, real weapons were used as a prop. And so that's where the Ellen Ramsey Road had been used in the Metamora, like relying on the appraisal by the federal company. Metamora was an Indian theme play that was based on the life of Metacomet, or King Philip, as he was known, and it was one of Forrest's most popular roles. And the appraiser may have simply assumed the knife was used in that role because it was the only weapon in the case that could have been. Everything else were more like rapiers and swords that wouldn't have fit. And so we think that may be what he was thinking. And he probably didn't know that the actual prop knife, the Metamora knife, which is here, had actually been sold 30 years earlier, along with the Metamora costume and the tomahawks. And I have a picture of one of the tomahawks there. And that, you know, they'd been sold in 1883 at an auction, and I've got a copy of the article. Well, Williamson eventually, you know, got a hold of the knife, and it was part of his collection. And Stanley Chan, who owns it, was kind enough to loan it to me for the display. But in 1988, a story appeared in American Notes and Queries, which was actually taken from a story that first appeared in 1880. And it says, it was said by Durand in his History of the Philadelphia Stage that the knife which Edwin Forest used in Metamora was the original Bowie knife. Well, that story got repeated in dozens of newspapers, and not only in the following year, but in years afterwards it appeared and appeared again. But nobody ever bothered to look to see what he actually said. And actually it wasn't Durand, his name is Charles Durang. And it wasn't a book, it was a series of newspaper articles that appeared from 1854 to 1863 in the Philadelphia Sunday Dispatch. And it was later compiled into a scrapbook. And fortunately, the Historical Society has one, and I finally found the pages that bear the story. Well, what he actually said in this story was, he says, speaking of Metamora and his knife, we may be allowed an episode that bears analogy to the Indian drum. He was talking about the Bowie knife by a way of analogy, not by saying that it was used in the play. And so he brings up this story, and he talks about, again, the knife fight, similar to the story that we saw, that we referred to earlier. But he concluded his account saying, this is the origin of the celebrated Bowie knife, which identical weapon is now in the possession of Mr. Edwin Forest, preserved among his many other rare relics. Forest, in his professional peregrinations down the Mississippi, was hospitably entertained by Colonel James Bowie at one of his plantations, where the citizen warrior presented the tragedian with his celebrated couteau. So he's identifying the knife given to Forrest as the one told in this fight story, not with Metamora. And if you look at, this is an early lithograph of Forrest, probably done in 1830 when he played in Boston. And you look at the engraving and the butt of the knife compared to the butt of the Metamora knife, you can see it's very similar. So it's pretty clear that if it wasn't that exact knife, it was a knife like that that Forrest was using, some kind of buckhorn hilted blade that fit with the Indian. And also, when you compare the size of the knife, and you imagine which one works better as a prop when you're on a stage, there's no close-up cameras, you know, you're far from the audience. You want something big that they can see. And you know, the blade on the Metamora knife is almost the length of the whole Forrest knife. Well, it's unlikely that this genuine Bowie knife was ever used as a prop. But even if it was, it would be no different than using a real sword or a real firearm for a play or a movie. So, I should go back here. Well, there's no doubt it was a genuine Bowie knife. It doesn't make it a gift from Bowie. but could the gift have been lost or replaced somewhere along the way? Well, here's the evidence I found that this knife is the knife that Forest claimed was given to him. Let's start with Henry Wyckoff. In his book, Reminiscences of the Idler, he wrote about Forest. Well, he traveled with Forest in 1835 in Europe. And this is well documented. Forest wrote letters to his mother about traveling with Henry Wyckoff. Wyckoff, among other activities in his long career, served as an undercover writer for the New York Herald, a diplomat for the U.S. and other countries. But he recounts this particular story when they were traveling in Russia, and he mentions that Forest had a long Bowie knife. Now, since the Forest knife is the only Bowie knife that Forest is known to have personally owned, and it certainly fits a long Bowie knife, it is more than plausible that this is the same knife. And Forest probably took it with him to England the next year when he appeared at Drury Lane Theatre as his acting debut in London. The manager of Drury Lane was Alfred Bunn, and he became Forrest's friend and actually managed his engagements in England. In 1853, Bunn published a book called Old England and New England, which was an account of his recent visit to America. And while he was mentioning the common presence of Bowie knives in Maryland, he adds a footnote about James Bowie. And he goes on to tell another story, fight story, the same sort of story that we've heard before. And he concludes with this: the original instrument, the blade of which is 12 3/4 inches long and 1 3/4 inches wide, 12 1/4 inches long, I should say, 1 3/4 inches wide, that did the deed, is now in the possession of Edwin Forest, to whom Bowie gave the steel and narrated the story. Well, that is the dimensions of the Forest knife. The fact that he gave the accurate dimensions means he probably saw it either in 1853 or more likely even in 1836. Again, he had no need to include this story in his book. It's a footnote if he had any doubt about Forest's veracity. But based on Bunn and Wyckoff, we can be pretty sure he had the knife no later than 1853 and pretty confident he had it in 1835. However, some people have noted a discrepancy between Alger's description of the handle of the Forest knife and Bowie's knife. He says it was a long, ugly thing, clustering with fearful associations by its very look, plain and cheap for real work, utterly unadorned, but the blade exquisitely tempered as to not break or bend too easily, and the handle corrugated with braids of steel that it might not slip when the hand got bloody. Well, the first knife part, of course, is definitely fits, but certainly not corrugated with braids of steel. But he might have just been remembering all these other swords that were in the case that had wire wraps, or maybe he was just embellishing the description, but more likely relying on a faulty memory, because there were swords with wire wrapped hilts in his collection, and remembering the way that the thing appeared to him. You know, there were sword grips and knives with sword-type grips, but there's no real corrugation there, and there's certainly not a crisscross. Well, they're not crisscross. There's no braided appearance. If you want braids, you want a pattern like this, but then you don't have corrugations. But this image hasn't been altered. It just was shot in a different light, and you can see where a person might think it's corrugated with braids of steel. Remember, Alger didn't complete the biography until 5 years after Forrest died, and probably been a long time since he saw the knife. Even this knife looks like it could have a wire-wrapped hilt, even though it's just checkered. Well, remember Gath, he also described the blade as being bent and sharpened at the top, and that doesn't exactly fit the Forrest knife. But it does have a slight clip. And I think that is likely to be because over the years he was exposed to a lot of Bowie knives. He was the youngest reporter to cover the Civil War. And when he's writing, when he said, "I just remember enough of the story to outline it," I think he's just conflated some memories that have crept in. Anyway, we know that when Reese wrote his book, he wrote under the name Colley Cybert. He originally wrote the article in, and again, the Bowie knife is there. And I have these out and then multiple stories over the years that talked about visitors to the Forest home who saw the knife. So, and you remember This story appeared in 1906, and again, you have the knife showing the actual picture of this. So remember, the knife was wired to the back, and it fits with Bunn's description of the exact dimensions of the knife. So the evidence is overwhelming that the Edwin Forest knife is the same knife that Forest claimed was given to him by James Bowie. So these are irrefutable facts. The Forest knife is a real knife, constructed like the knives of the period. We know Forest claimed to know James Bowie and get a knife from him. People who knew Forest said he was honest. The knife he claimed to receive has been seen over many years, and it resided in the arms cabinet of the Forest home from the time it was put in there until it was taken out in 1987. The blade matches the dimensions by Forest, a Forest knife by Bunn, and there are no facts that preclude it from being a knife from Bowie. So my book should be coming out hopefully this summer. I've got an editor now to go through it. I've got a draft of it on my table, and there's a lot more detail. I've got 2,000 footnotes. There's a lot of material besides on the Forest knife, a lot about Bowie knives that I've discovered in my research that I thought would be interesting to collectors. Well, does this all prove that it was that Forest got a knife from Bowie and this is it? Well, I think the answers are yes, but if you're looking for absolute proof, there's no absolute proof for any old knife. I think though that the evidence is overwhelming if you're open-minded, and the provenance is certainly better than on most. Well, just in conclusion, when Williamson wrote a book on the American Bowie knife, he thought the original knife came from some kind of Spanish dagger with a more rounded blade. And then he put out the progression, which I have on display there, of the Bowie knives. And as you can see, you put those knives, and you can see how the Forest knife certainly fits within the progression. And if you've seen the copy of Knife magazine that's been out and distributed, and Mark Zaleski has on his table, which is this one, James Batson shows a pretty thorough analysis of the blades of the Reason Bowie gift knives and the Forest knife to show how they basically follow the same pattern. And this is taken actually from the magazine. And you can see he overlaid the Forest knife to see that he thinks that was the original style. Then just one last thing, and we're going to wrap this up. And it's kind of a footnote, but I need to do this because in January a knife was offered for sale as Reason Bowie's gift to Edwin Forest. It's a California knife made by Shively of New York, and Bob Abels had it in his collection. Originally proposed that because Lucy Bowie said that Forest was given a knife, that this must be it. Even though this knife is engraved with a present, she said it became quite the fancy for Reason to give away knives. She says a third was given to Edwin Forest. Based on that, a knife, because it was presented by Edwin Forest to Joseph Davis, February 19, 1849, he assumed, well, that must be the knife that Bowie gave away in, who knows, in the 1830s. Well, it's a Chevier's California knife, and nobody was going to make a California knife until the gold rush started in late 1848, 1849. That's because before that it was part of Mexico until the Mexican-American War was settled at the end of 48 when we got California. It was called Alta California. It was part of Mexico. So, in fact, there's an ad for California knives by Chevier that appeared in February of 1849. So, I just want people to know that it's a good California knife. It was presented by Forest to Joseph Davis. It has nothing to do with James Bowie, but now you know. So, thank you. And if any of you are interested, I do have some copies of mine.
I would like one of those things.
Okay, I've got them a bunch at my table.
Okay.